Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 97 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. Friend of the show, Dr. Jerrod Brown, is back with us once again today. This time speaking on the topic of self-regulation. Specifically, we are going to find out just what is self-regulation, what causes self-regulation deficits, and of course, some intervention strategies to consider. For you risk, need, responsivity champions out there, recall that we use the domain of one's criminal history to capture low self-regulation. So that is the lens you should view this through as to context. If you've not already done so, I encourage you to go back and check out Dr. Brown's previous appearances on the Criminologist podcast. Jerrod Brown, PhD, is a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant with multiple years of experience teaching collegiate courses. Jerrod is currently an assistant professor, program director, and lead developer for the Master of Arts degree in Human Services with an emphasis in forensic behavioral health and a second emphasis area in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies for Concordia University in St. Paul, Minnesota. Dr. Brown has provided consultation services to a number of caregivers, professionals, and organizations pertaining to the topics related to autism spectrum disorder, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, confabulation, suggestibility, trauma and other life adversities, traumatic brain injury, and youth fire setting. Dr. Brown has also conducted numerous trainings for professionals and student audiences. He is co-founder and CEO of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies and editor-in-chief of Forensic Scholars Today. So pleased to have Jerrod back on the show, always enlightened when he joins us. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Jerrod Brown, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome back to the show, Dr. Jerrod Brown from Concordia University. I say that because you've made multiple appearances in the past, which I appreciate. So many of our listeners are familiar with you, familiar with your work, but for maybe somebody tuning in for the first time because they're intrigued about today's topic of self-regulation, why don't you go ahead and give yourself a little bit of an introduction, tell newer listeners a little bit about your background, educationally, vocationally, and so forth.
You bet. Thanks, Joe, for having me back. Hope everyone's doing well. Thanks for tuning in for today's podcast. So my name's Jerrod. I am a professor, trainer, consultant, researcher. Most of the work that I've done really focuses around the topics of neurodevelopmental disorders, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, autism. I do some work in the area of confabulation, which is false memory creation, which is actually more common than people realize, and it has significant implications for the criminal justice and the mental health arena. Do some work in the area of suggestibility. That is so important. When you study confabulation, you have to study suggestibility and vice versa. So we have to really be careful in the way in which we phrase questions, body language, tone of voice, lots of things like that. I do quite a bit of work on topics related to youth fire setting as well. And I am heavily involved in the world of trauma. So I do a lot of work in the area of complex developmental trauma, adverse childhood experiences. And what we're talking about today is self-regulation. And It's such an important topic. And if you're working in the criminal justice system, you are probably working with clients, never say 100%, but most clients in the criminal justice system have probably gotten involved in the justice system directly or indirectly because of self-regulation issues, self-control issues. You'll hear me talk about inhibition. That's our internal parking brake. Being able to shift attention. All these things have significant implications for the legal system. But self-regulation has implications for how you parent, how you drive a car. It relates to how much sleep we get at night, how we monitor our energy, screen time use. It relates to obesity. I mean, the list goes on. So it doesn't matter what field you're in. This topic is very, very important. And self-regulation deficits just don't impact the clients you work with. We're all prone to these issues from time to time. Just burnout in general or not getting a good night's sleep can make us more dysregulated. But there are certain populations and factors that make it even worse, which we'll dig deep into. So
I should frame this, Jerrod. You mentioned we're going to talk about self-regulation within a lot of different contexts. We are going to approach this as a two-part series. So this episode talking about self-regulation in a broader sense. And then in part 2, we're going to narrow that focus down a bit more for criminal justice interventions, justice-involved individuals. But as you said, this touches on so many different aspects of our lives and so many different vocations that our listeners may be involved with. Broadly speaking, Jerrod, how would you define self-regulation, or what is self-regulation?
I see self-regulation as kind of a big umbrella term, and under there you have all kinds of things. So if you have clients who have a real difficult time regulating their emotions, that's a self-regulation issue. So if you have if they can't accept feedback and they just go off and start yelling and screaming, that's a self-regulation issue. If someone has a real difficult time managing their motivation, so if you're working with clients that struggle with boredom is absolutely a critical skill to learn. Being bored is not a bad thing. I have known several clients who have just a very difficult time with boredom. If you've ever worked with people with addictive tendencies, I hear this repeatedly from people that have had addictive types of disorders. A big trigger for them is boredom. Work with people on boredom. If you have a client that can't handle or manage boredom, that's a self-regulation issue. Procrastination is actually a self-regulation issue. Who hasn't procrastinated? We all do from time to time. If you Google procrastination and self-regulation, there are so many articles that have been published on that. Another very important component. And these things can really get in the way of your client being successful on probation or parole or any type of treatment plan or goal plan or case management, doesn't matter. There's something called regulation of cognition. So maybe you have a client you're sitting and doing an interview with. They can't stay focused on that interview. They can't stay focused on you and the questions. They easily get distracted. High levels of distraction and people that can't stay focused on the topic at hand should alert you that you might be working with someone that might have some self-regulation issues. People that can't regulate their social interactions, like just body movements, talking too much, not talking enough. There's a lot of self-regulation components to the social world too. So we'll talk about that. And just being on the lookout too for kind of just odd mannerisms, odd physical behavior, people that can't sit still and fidget all around. That could be a self-regulation issue too. Obviously, those are red flag indicators for a whole bunch of other things too. But stay curious, dig deeper. If we were to break it down a little bit more, you have cognitive components of self-regulation. Attention, like focused attention. Can your client sit through group treatment, court-ordered treatment for an hour, or after 5 minutes, they're gone, zoned out. They just can't stay focused. there's something called executive function. If you've tuned into any of the podcasts I've done with Joe, you have probably heard me talk about that. The cognitive components of self-regulation really fall under the umbrella of executive function. That's the CEO of the brain. It's the boss of the brain. It guides the bus with behavior. People in prison, people with extensive criminal history backgrounds, people with extensive trauma histories, people with brain injuries have executive functioning impairments typically. Self-monitoring, if you have a client and they have a really hard time monitoring their own thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and actions, self-monitoring deficits are a component of this too, so you want to be aware of that. People that really, really struggle with engaging in pro-social problem solving, that could indicate a cognitive deficit under the umbrella of self-regulation. Even perspective taking. You ever work with clients and they have a real hard time understanding the perspectives of other people. When you work with a client who has true perspective taking deficits, that client could come off as arrogant, cold, callous, aloof, removed. It's all one-centered, always about them. Maybe there's something else going on that's contributing to them doing that. Could be some brain-based impairments, could be some trauma, who knows. So those are the cognitive components. Now you have the emotional components of self-regulation. So how does that client manage strong feelings or emotionally arousing situations? Can they manage those situations? Or do they just go off and crumble and they're highly irritable and they yell, scream, fight? You work in domestic violence treatment or intervention, your probation officer supervising people with domestic violence histories. Lots and lots of research on the link between self-regulation issues, domestic violence perpetration. You work with people with a long history of engaging in child abuse and just other types of harmful, reckless behavior. That's more times than not, they probably have some self-regulation issues. Then you have the behavioral component of self-regulation. You ever worked with clients in the criminal justice system who can't follow rules? That is an indication of maybe some behavioral self-regulation. How about clients who can't delay gratification? People that have a real hard time putting on the brakes and not picking up that extra pop right before bedtime. Or someone's trying to quit smoking, or they have a sugar addiction, or any type of addictive tendency. If your listeners want to study delaying of gratification, Google the marshmallow test. That's a classic test that talks about delaying gratification. If you have a client who just really struggles with staying persistent, staying motivated, and they lack grit, that could be a component of behavioral self-regulation issues. Impulse control problems, conflict resolution issues, not being able to engage in active and positive coping skills, and someone that can never achieve goals, look through a behavioral self-regulation lens. There could be something going on there. So, Joe, any thoughts on that? Just kind of giving the readers just a broad spectrum, 40-hour overview in about 10 minutes.
As you were speaking, I was nodding my head, affirming a lot of what you were posing as far as clients that I have supervised, and I imagine other probation, parole, corrections officials were nodding their head, saying, yeah, that sounds familiar. Yes, I have that type of client. I want to take a quick break and point out that, again, many of our listeners operate under the risk, need, responsivity framework, and we deal all the time with so-called criminogenic need and what we refer to as the central 8. So lest any of my listeners are saying, well, wait a minute, Joe, we don't see self-regulation in our risk assessment tools, but we see all these behaviors that Jerrod's describing. You do see self-regulation in those assessment tools, but they're captured within the criminal history domain. Think of criminal history as almost a proxy for low self-regulation. So again, if you've got client A and client B, and client A has a criminal history as long as my arm, that is reflective of low self-regulation. That is something that Bonta and Andrews have acknowledged could have been captured better in their tool. Some of the research that came out subsequent to their initial publishing really showed that self-regulation is, and you're picking this up here from Jerrod, the granddaddy of criminogenic need. It really is a big driver of criminality. So again, think of self-regulation as being captured in that criminal history domain, which, as a quick aside, is always why I somewhat bristle when I hear folks refer to that as a static area. It can only get worse. It can't get better. That's true, but it doesn't mean we can't address the root causes, which again, self-regulation. So go ahead, Jerrod. I wanted to set my listeners straight there who may have been thinking, oh, this is all great, but we don't see this in assessment.
There are countless interventions and strategies that can help improve this. We can talk about that today too. When I talk today about self-regulation, I'm going to talk about it within the context of self-control as well. Now, if you go deep into this literature, some authors talk about those two a little differently, but there's a lot of authors that just say it's the same thing, but they're using the different terms. So self-regulation, self-control, from my lens, is the same thing, what we're talking about today.
So to that end, Jerrod, because I also hear thrown about in the same context sometimes, people talk about impulsivity or even risk-taking behavior. Should we lump those all together, or should we be cautious about that?
They're all different lines of research. If you were to use those search terms, you'll find different lines of research. But this is just me. Every researcher, all that has different. I would say self-regulation, umbrella term. Under there, I mean, we're going to have impulse control problems, self-control, inhibition, but some other terms that your listeners may not be familiar with. Volitional control, you can Google that. Effortful control, all kinds of different little subdomains that fall under that umbrella. But a lot of the things we're talking about today are going to relate to all these things. If we want to expand this into a 3 or 10-part series, we can do that too. To give your listeners a little more foundation about self-regulation. So if you're working with kids in the juvenile justice system or adults, doesn't matter what age, we got to understand the building blocks of self-regulation. Self-regulation really starts in utero. So if mom's pregnant and she is using drugs or alcohol, she is chronically sleep deprived, she's in a violent relationship, she's in poverty, homelessness, going through tons and tons of stress. All of that stress, all of that not so good stuff gets passed down to the developing child in utero, which then can have a negative impact on brain development, body development. Some of your listeners, if they tuned in, they've heard me talk about the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal axis. It's our main stress response system. When that's damaged by trauma, adversity, hardship, that can be damaged in utero. If that is dysregulated or damaged, that can contribute to some of these issues. But some of the building blocks of self-regulation is going to be attention and concentration. So if you're working with young kids, strengthen their attention, strengthen their concentration. If you work with kids that have profound attention deficit issues, concentration issues, they probably deal with some self-control issues, very important target area. Focus on behavioral and emotional and executive functioning development as early on as possible. Teaching people, learning how to be more planful in organization and learning how to sequence, those are some critical building blocks of self-regulation. Language development, huge connection between language deficits and self-regulation deficits. There is a very high percentage of people in prison that have language deficits, particularly undiagnosed, and there's actually a lot of research to support that. So really looking at language capability. So if you're working with young kids and they're having self-regulation issues, maybe a referral to a speech-language pathologist for an assessment would be a good thing. If you're working with an adult and you notice some comprehension, language, or communication, referral to a speech-language pathologist. Obviously, early intervention is key, but regardless of the age, there are things we can do to help make things at least better. I'm not going to cure it probably, but it could make it better. Sensory processing. People with sensory processing issues are more likely to have self-regulation issues. If you have sensory processing issues, bright lights may bug you. People talking too fast could bug you. Certain textures, certain smells, certain foods. Maybe it's working with a sensory processing specialist or an occupational therapist. I point out these other disciplines because none of us have the expertise in all of these areas. We have to work from a multidisciplinary lens. Social skill ability is a critical building block of self-regulation. We know so many people who come into contact with the criminal justice system have deficits in the area of the social realm. Maybe it's that perspective taking. Maybe it's empathy deficits. Something called mentalization. Definitely look that up. Theory of mind relates to internal mental states and perspective taking. Another good search term, social cognition, is kind of the umbrella term. I would definitely be aware of that term. But strengthening social skills early on in life can be helpful. Working memory is also a critical component to self-regulation. Working memory is a major component that falls under the umbrella of executive function. Some researchers call working memory our brain's post-it note. So if you have a client who has true working memory deficits, and if you ask a bunch of questions, they're going to shut down in most cases. They can't take in a lot of information. Multitasking is not good. If they're court-ordered to treatment and no treatment provider has assessed or detected working memory deficits, they might not be successful in that group because they can get overwhelmed with too much going on at once. When someone has working memory deficits, slow down the pace of the interview. Take your time, fact check, verify. We can take things off our working memory by writing things down. So if you just think it's our brain's post-it note, you go to the grocery store and you're trying to think about all of these things you need to remember to get at the grocery store. Maybe most people could hang on to 5, 6 things. Someone with working memory might only be able to hold on to one thing before they forget. Writing it down and just making a list is absolutely important, critical, easy thing to do. Making things visual. So those are a few things to think about with building blocks. What about the causes? Million causes for why self-regulation issues happen, but some of the more common ones, if we look through kind of a criminal justice lens, again, any type of prenatal trauma that happened, drug abuse, alcohol use, domestic violence during pregnancy, so prenatal trauma, big factor. Postnatal trauma, any type of trauma that child was exposed to in childhood. They witnessed parents' domestic violence, being aware of complex developmental trauma, toxic stress exposure, the adverse childhood experiences research, caregiver neglect, and even caregiver unresponsiveness can contribute to this. What happens if the caregiver has self-regulation issues? The child is in that environment, observes that. They start picking up on those mannerisms. So parental self-regulation deficits that are modeled to kids unknowingly can contribute to that child then developing those behavioral patterns. So if you're a probation officer or whoever you are and you're working with caregivers who have kids and they struggle with self-regulation, that's an important target area.
So I made a note of it here, Jerrod, and you beat me to the punch when you mentioned ACEs. So if I heard you correctly, trauma, ACEs may lead to self-regulation deficits. And as I just noted, self-regulation is criminogenic. So to what degree can we connect those dots, I guess, then between ACEs/trauma, self-regulation to criminogenic need?
Huge connection. Just if your listeners just Google the forensic aspects of adverse childhood experiences, you're going to find a lot of studies that come up. It's never impossible, but it's almost impossible, in my opinion, if a child has had extensive trauma in childhood, and that trauma has never been acknowledged, addressed, treated, or managed, and that child continues to be in that environment and no one's ever helped, it's near impossible for that child not to start developing some self-regulation deficits, really in two ways. They're learning it environmentally, so they're being modeled maybe by the caregiver that maybe under stress, this is how I react. I scream, I throw things. The other way it can happen is toxic stress and trauma can actually damage parts of the developing brain that are responsible for self-regulation as that child gets a little older. And if they're dealing with these issues, and I never want to say it's 100%, and there's always hope, but if nothing's ever addressed and these things go on, the child gets older, becomes 5 or 6, enters K through 12 setting, what happens? Most of the time, or a very high percentage of the time, they're going to have some issues in school. Maybe these issues start looking like they have ADHD or a disruptive behavioral disorder like oppositional defiant disorder. The school doesn't take into account there's a trauma history here. The child gets labeled with a disorder. Maybe they have, but maybe they don't, but it looks like that because of untreated trauma. Child's placed in special education, maybe. I'm just throwing out a possible trajectory. As that child gets older, kids of the same age start kind of pulling back from that child because that child's starting to really demonstrate behaviors that don't seem age appropriate. Other kids are kind of starting to tease and bully that individual. As the kid gets older, they start going inward. They start developing more anger. Maybe they start associating with a negative peer group. They're starting to now dabble with drugs and alcohol. They're teenagers, and they're really behind in school. When they're behind in school, maybe they're lacking social deficits. It's harder for them to graduate in some cases. It's harder for them to find a well-paying job. Brings them into contact with the criminal justice system. They go to jail or prison. We know rates of traumatic brain injury are higher in this population. So now we have a brain injury on top of the trauma, on top of the self-regulation. It's just fuel on the fire. The person's convicted of a crime, goes to prison, experiences some more trauma there, gets released, but no release planner, no probation officer has really connected the dots here that there's a lot going on here, and we really need to take a better look here and develop a trauma-informed, brain injury-informed, self-regulation-informed supervision plan to really help this person thrive. This is just one trajectory of a million, but if we could identify this early on and recognize this and look through those lenses, I think much better outcomes can happen.
You mentioned this is one trajectory of a million, and I'm relatively certain that at least some of my listeners out there are pulling their hair out saying, time out, Joe, time out, Jerrod. Trauma's rampant. It's not such a clear line from trauma to criminality, which we should make that point that, yes, there are plenty of individuals who unfortunately experience trauma, and that doesn't lead to substance abuse or it doesn't lead to criminality. Again, as you said, there's various pathways. My position is just that we should be aware of all of them.
Absolutely. I mean, we have to consider trauma. We know most people in prison have had trauma histories, if you believe the research. Most people in prison have had a brain injury, if you believe the research. When I say most people, over 50%. Some populations are higher. If you just put those two things together, lack of sleep is so common. ADHD diagnoses are very common in correctional settings. Attachment problems are very common. Just environmental instability is very common. All of those factors, it's kind of a cumulative thing. It's not going to just be one factor. There's multiple things going on. But usually what's the first thing that's happened to these individuals? Trauma. Trauma can happen in so many ways. We've all experienced trauma directly or indirectly. But the research really leans to the fact people, especially long-term offenders, individuals that have had extensive criminal backgrounds, typically have not just had one trauma happen to them. If it's multiple traumas over a longer period of time, look at the complex and developmental trauma literature. And if you look through that lens, I think you're going to be in a much better position to approach, especially high-risk offenders, individuals that just consistently are not successful on probation or parole. And could there be some neurocognitive impairments, brain-based impairments? Most times, probably some executive functioning impairments. We know that is extremely common among criminal justice involved populations. If you just Google violent criminal offending and executive dysfunction, have fun reading 1,000 articles this weekend. I'm exaggerating there, but there's a ton on these things. So there's a lot of layers to this. But self-regulation, if you can become self-regulation informed, tack that on to becoming trauma informed. It's only going to help you out. If you're wrong and you use these approaches, it doesn't matter. These approaches are great for any human being on the planet. I truly believe that.
Jerrod, I love using analogies when I teach and when I train. And thus far from you, I'm going to steal executive function, the CEO of the brain that's driving the bus, working memory, and the Post-it note analogy. Remind me what the parking brake was again.
Inhibition. And then there's something called cognitive or psychological flexibility, which is the other big component of executive function. And that is a critical component to being adaptable and flexible and resilient. And we know resilient-based approaches really fall under the umbrella of trauma-informed care. And cognitive flexibility, a good analogy would be you're driving down the road in your car and you have a stick shift. You shift because you know you need to get to that next gear, and you slow down, you shift it down, you're going on the highway, you put in automatic. People with cognitive inflexibility issues don't have a good shifter. They get stuck. They get focused on one thing. It's almost rumination, and they can't shift between topics. And that is a driver for so many problematic outcomes. So what happens, you go down the road and you get in the highway and you keep it in first gear and you go 70, your engine is eventually going to blow. So those are some good analogies to think about.
I love it. I love it. I want to talk to you about some more of the cognitive behavioral interventions and other intervention strategies in general. But before we move on, I want to make sure we cover everything. You've talked about some of the consequences associated with self-regulation deficits, for example, criminal justice involvement. What are some other consequences associated with, again, those self-regulation deficits?
If you work with clients with an extensive history of risk-taking behaviors or just poor health-taking behaviors, dig deeper. That could be an indication of some self-regulation issues. So are they engaging in activities that are harmful or dangerous to themselves or other people? Or maybe they're engaging in really risky social behavior, where I've consulted on some cases where the client meets somebody at the bus stop, doesn't know them, invites them home to move in with them. That is a very risky social behavior. Risky sexual behavior, look at patterns of that. Risky driving behaviors, risky financial behaviors. So looking at driving records, people with extensive driving violations, could there be some self-control inhibition issues there too? If they're making really poor financial decisions, running up the credit card, spending all their money, and they don't have money left over to pay their bills, could there be something going on there? Ruling out any head injury history, co-occurring substance misuse, but also a couple things I think people don't realize, looking at one's food intake. Extensive overeating and chronic obesity could be a factor. There's so much research on self-control issues and obesity problems. Looking at that, sugar consumption addiction, tobacco, caffeine, work-life balance, people that have a real hard time not just overworking all the time, that could be a self-control issue in some capacity. And I'm guilty as charged with that. So those are a few things you'd want to really take into account. So when self-regulation is working well, it absolutely plays an important role in one's ability to respond empathetically to others. It plays a very critical role in moral development. So if you have clients that really struggle with just having good ethical and legal and moral standards, There's some research to definitely look through a self-regulation lens. How does someone express themselves emotionally? People with good self-regulation typically are in a better position to name and label their emotions when they're mad. People that have a hard time labeling and naming their emotions and it comes out sideways as anger, aggression, and violence, something to be on the lookout for. Adjustment. If you have a client that has a real hard time adjusting and just being flexible, and maybe they have a real hard time with uncertainty. Look at that too, uncertainty. How do they handle that? So those are all things. And self-regulation is so critical for goal achievement. It doesn't matter what goal it is. If it's an exercise goal, if it's a work goal, if it's a family goal, it plays a real critical development. But it also plays a critical development in language and math and reading and literacy skills and our overall physical health and quality of life. So people with greater self-regulation typically do better in school, they're healthier, and they have better mental health. People with really poor self-regulation may be more likely to engage in health risk behaviors that set themselves up for just problems over the long haul. They're more likely to have mental health problems, substance use problems, come into contact with the criminal justice system, and having issues with employment. So those are just some general things. Again, it can vary from person to person depending on a host of factors.
So I teased this a minute ago. What are some intervention strategies to consider?
Exercise, deep breathing, getting good sleep, journaling, reflective journaling can help. Role-playing, if you're a professional, role-playing and modeling what good self-regulation looks like. Maybe you're working with people with special needs, neurodevelopmental disorders. Looking at social stories. You can go online and Google social stories. That is a great way to help someone identify and solve a particular problem. Using strategies that allow that client to gain more control over their behaviors. So helping with choice making, decision making, helping them gain more personal independence if possible, more like self-determination, those kind of things can be helpful. The research really leans to the fact too, using suggestions rather than commands. It's difficult in the criminal justice system, I get it, but if you come at someone just guns blazing, power over, that can amplify the situation. So again, maybe it's using motivational interviewing, trauma-informed care, attachment-based approaches. Providing the person opportunities to create more self-awareness too, helping them become more self-aware of their own triggers, their own reactions. So helping them gain more awareness, and journaling can be a good thing. Empathetic responding on the caregiver's part or the professional's part. Using empathy can help diffuse that situation and actually really lead to some positive outcomes. Helping people, just if there are rules that they have to follow, making sure they understand the rules, verbalize them, coach it, model it, teach it, making it visual, because a lot of clients may have some abstract reasoning deficits. They have a hard time connecting the dots, planning for the future. So those could be some things. Predictability in the environment has been shown to be helpful. So structure, consistency, predictability. A couple other things the research really points to: attunement, validation when someone's doing a good job, praise and positive attention, making sure the approaches you're using are emotionally and developmentally appropriate, because just because you're supervising someone on probation, ISR, parole, and they're 20 years old chronologically, does their brain function like a 20-year-old? Maybe they function like a 10 or 12-year-old. Developmentally appropriate approaches, very, very helpful. The more we can stay calm and regulated and patient, that helps. One of the worst things we can do is become impatient. We're all guilty of this from time to time, but self-care for the professional, and we can be patient, kind, calm, curious. Those are some good things. Some of the clients you may work with may have some processing speed or auditory processing speed weaknesses. So be careful with how fast you ask questions. If the client doesn't respond to you right away, don't jump to the conclusion that they're not wanting to respond. Maybe their cognitive, their executive functioning capabilities aren't working properly and they need extra time to respond. So be okay with silence. Also, teach limit setting, teaching boundaries. Avoid multitasking, staying focused, managing your fatigue too. Once someone becomes very fatigued, that is an accelerant for self-regulation issues. So pay really good attention to fatigue management, and ruling out any comorbidities, psychiatric issues, depression, anxiety, maybe it's some neurological issues, learning challenges, memory issues. Maybe it's some physical health issues. Maybe they're dealing with an untreated pain disorder no one's really picked up on and the person's in such discomfort. Maybe they haven't slept in 2 days. Maybe they're dealing with digestive health issues. So if you look at these comorbidities,
the good news, Dr. Brown, is that as you were speaking,
that.
A lot of those interventions fall under what I would refer to as our core correctional practices or core correctional skills. I made a note to ask you about motivational interview, and you beat me to the punch when you threw MI out there. And again, that's the good news, is that's already in the wheelhouse for corrections practitioners. So it's reaffirming to know that we're on the right track with that. The other core correctional practice or core correctional skill that kept coming up in my mind, at least when you spoke, were the traditional cognitive behavioral interventions that we are already employing. You mentioned social skills, for example. What about problem solving or even cognitive restructuring techniques? Would that behoove this population as well?
Be great. Go online. Your readers can Google problem solving therapy. There is something called metacognition training, metacognitive training. So we talked executive function, CEO of the brain. Metacognition is the boss of the CEO. Top dog of the brain, metacognition. Thinking about thinking, knowing about knowing, helping people become more self-aware, gaining insight. It helps with problem solving, decision making, conflict resolution, learning capabilities. That is good for anybody. So metacognition training would be wonderful. There's a program you can go online too. They have a great website. It's called the Alert Program, and they have workbooks on there for self-regulation and lots of great trainings, lots of cool stuff. There's other like training companies out there that focus on self-regulation. There's workbooks. People can go on and just type in Amazon and find different things. There's lots of screening tools for self-regulation for various populations as well.
And again, great to know, for at least for my listeners who are employing some of these core correctional practices, that, hey, you're doing the right thing. So it's almost, when I hear this news, Jerrod, like I said, almost an affirmation or a recognition that, yep, this is working with the populations. But if nothing else, it tells us, give those your due diligence, because they may be a little bit more important than you previously thought. Definitely going to have to do a two-parter here, and I took notes feverishly through this interview, so we'll have lots to talk about in part 2 when we drill down a little bit more about self-regulation and how it plays out in the criminal justice field.
Look forward to it.
Dr. Jerrod Brown from Concordia University, also the CEO of APHIS, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. Always a pleasure having you on the show, my friend. We'll have you back very soon for part 2 of self-regulation.
Thank you, Joe. Had a wonderful time.
All right. Until next time, friend.
A quick break from the show to give a shout out to our friends at APHIS, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. APHIS is a professional organization dedicated to uniting the forensic communities of criminal justice, education, law, medicine, and psychology. APHIS is a leader in building relationships within the forensic community, locally and nationally. The mission of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies is to provide quality education, training, consultation, and research in the forensic studies to professionals and students. APHIS is a leader in connecting members with one another to help facilitate professional growth, increase competency, and awareness in forensic mental health studies. For details as to upcoming training events, webinars, or publications, please visit them at www.aiafs.com. And now, back to the show.
A big criminologist thank you to Dr. Jerrod Brown of Concordia University. Make sure to listen for his return when we wrap up this two-part series on self-regulation. In the meantime, if this topic was intriguing to you, go back and check out episode 70 of The Criminologist, my interview with Brad Bogue. Brad talked about this issue of self-regulation as well and how it is captured or not captured in our existing risk-need responsivity assessments. In fact, what I will do is leave a link for that interview with Brad Bogue in the episode description of this program. Hey, back next week with a fresh episode. Keeping it stateside, super psyched to be bringing you my conversation with Albert Banuelos. Albert is the probation director for the Los Angeles County Probation Department. That is going to be a fascinating interview, trust me. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices, implementation, program design, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email of thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. I'm going international again, folks. You're not going to want to miss out on my travels. We are also on Twitter, The Criminologist Media Group, at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this program. Merchandise is now available. Reach out if you'd like to be seen in the office with a cool Criminologist pen, refrigerator magnet, or coffee mug. And if you believe what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
People in prison, people with extensive criminal history backgrounds, people with extensive trauma histories, people with brain injuries have executive functioning impairments typically.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.